Fugues had this sort of sense of chasing and complexity that wasn't really fashionable. But Beethoven loved a good fugue. And he thought, well, I know this is not what everybody wants, but this is what you're going to get.
Hi, thanks for listening to this episode of Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet. In this series, Australian String Quartet violinists Dale Barltrop and Francesca Hiew, violist Chris Cartlidge and cellist Michael Dahlenburg give you an insider's perspective into the meanings and mechanics of some of the most notable string quartets in history. My name is Sam Jozeps. I'll be your guide through this podcast. I'm really excited to present this episode to you on Ludwig van Beethoven's String Quartet No.9 in C major, Op.59 No.3, Razumovsky. There is so much to unpack about this work, but before we get into it, I want to give you a quick overview of Beethoven. He was born in Germany in 1770, over 250 years ago. He lived most of his life in Vienna, Austria. He published 722 works across 45 years, a huge amount of music. Two of his works, a symphony and a string quartet, feature on NASA's Golden Record, which is aboard the Voyager spacecraft, currently about 24 billion kilometres away from Earth. Beethoven came after the likes of Haydn, Bach and Mozart, and before the likes of Schubert, Mendelssohn, Chopin, Brahms and Debussy. If you're into eras, he straddled the classical and the romantic. Some of the first things you learn about Beethoven is that he was an incredible musician. He went deaf when he was quite young, but despite this, continued to write music and perform afterwards. Some say he wrote his best works, including perhaps one of the most recognisable melodies in history, his Ode to Joy, when he had completely lost his ability to hear. Despite the aforementioned joy, though, you might also learn that he had a reputation as being a pretty grumpy guy. What I want to know is this. Despite the more than 250 years of musical creation since his time, what is it about Beethoven and his music that makes him regarded by so many as perhaps the greatest and most influential composer of all time? In the next 15 minutes or so, Dale, Fran, Chris and Michael of the Australian String Quartet will speak about what Beethoven means to them and their experience of discovering this particular string quartet.
My name is Dale Barltrop.
My name is Francesca Hiew.
My name is Chris Cartlidge.
And I'm Michael Dahlenburg from the Australian String Quartet.
I hope you enjoy this episode of Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet.
Beethoven, what can I say? He is my desert island composer. I don't think there's any other composer in history who speaks to the range of human emotions and struggles and triumphs like Beethoven does. And for me, his music is ultimately an expression of humanity.
I think most people know he went deaf. Not many people recognise that he was in fact deaf for most of the bigger works that we all know and love him for.
We have these incredibly pervasive snippets of his music through culture and society, and every time you hop in a cab there's a bit of Beethoven.
So I'm just going to jump in here really quickly. As Chris said, if you've ever hopped in an Australian taxi and heard this sound and think it sounds familiar, but you're not quite sure where it's from, it's the first phrases of the second movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony.
Yeah, he's often touted as this sort of misanthrope who goes around scowling at everyone, but I just don't necessarily believe that that was the man he was. He had a real warmth in him. I mean, he must have to have been able to produce the music that he did. I think he was a really optimistic person, actually. To battle through this awful reality, to create things that really, bring people so much joy. The Ninth Symphony, for example, he really overcomes all of the tragedy that he had to live through, which I think speaks more to his character than the way we simplify it as this sort of grumpy old man.
There was a really interesting quote I read, and it said, a painter doesn't paint a picture of a tree because he saw a tree, but because he saw another picture of a tree. And thus, a composer doesn't write a quartet because he thought of a quartet. He writes because of the result of hearing another quartet. And it's really interesting when you frame somebody who is Beethoven, this sort of mythical figure, in that light. So he arrived in Vienna some 15 or so years after Mozart had been the big deal. And he followed on from Haydn. And these are two behemoths of music. And before he even got there, there was this expectation that Beethoven was going to be a big deal. Mostly because Beethoven was really good at selling himself. Like, he was amazing at networking, like really amazing. In his first few years, he managed to accrue sponsorship that equaled, say, like Schubert, the same amount of money in his first few years as Schubert had at the end of his life, which was like a big deal. It meant he could have like a housekeeper and a cleaner and somebody to yell at. Anyway, so he followed on from this tradition that Haydn had created of Western classical music, and then Mozart made even sort of more accessible and more revolutionary. And then Beethoven came along after that.
So Joseph Haydn. He's the guy who's kind of credited as establishing the string quartet as we know it. 2 violins, a viola and cello, and making it mainstream. And Mozart and Haydn were great mates. Mozart, who was 26 years younger than Haydn, referred to him affectionately as teacher. So it seems that a lot of Haydn kind of rubbed off on Mozart. And up until this point in time, they were like the musical influences of the day. Back to Michael and Beethoven.
He was a sort of an anarchist, and he saw what everybody had done before him, and he wanted to do something new, which was really interesting because in the time in Vienna, the sort of 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s, that was not the deal. Everybody was wanting more Haydn or Mozart. And then here comes this sort of revolutionary figure who said, well, yeah, I'm not going to do that. He also was looking for something bigger, something that sort of broke the mold of formula and scale and emotion. And that is evident in every single one of his quartets, taking what everybody was expecting and then changing it, which to me says oh so much about him as a person.
So this particular string quartet, the third of the Razumovskys, actually happens to be the first Beethoven string quartet I ever worked on as a student. And so it has a very special place in my heart.
He actually wrote this piece around the same time that he acknowledged that he was actually deaf. You know, fancy a musician not being able to hear.
This brilliant musician who had an amazing ear, who used to sit down at the piano, quite literally, and just improvise his way through a concert. Complete deafness.
Absolute heartbreak. But what I find so amazing about this piece is that it is so jubilant and joyful in character, which is such a surprise given where he was at himself.
This is kind of a turning point in his writing. We have so many years of this deafness creeping, then really catching up with him, and he acknowledges that this is who he is, and he shouldn't hide it.
And the whole quartet sort of is this journey, I feel, where he's sort of finding, well, what happens now that I can't hear?
And this turning point, that we see a massive shift towards some of the greatest music ever written from this point.
It's the third of a group of 3 that were commissioned by Count Razumovsky, who was the Russian ambassador to Vienna at the time and a patron and friend of Beethoven's.
Usually that's pretty much all anybody ever says about Count Razumovsky, but actually he was an amateur violinist and a huge lover of chamber music and art. And he built a house where he had a lot of chamber music concerts and filled it with lots of art. And one day, actually, he was having a big party, huge party. And he invited lots of people over and he built an extension at the back of the house. And the extension caught fire, burned everything down. And he literally obliterated centuries of artwork. And ironically, he then failed upwards and they made him a prince after that. So hope for the rest of us.
And this particular quartet, in fact, all three of the Razumovsky quartets really took the genre to new heights. He expanded the form and made the quartet into something that was much more symphonic, much grander, and a real sense of journey and the struggle to overcome adversity. But particularly the third Razumovsky, it's in the key of C major, which is traditionally a very bright, joyous, happy, open key. But what he does with this quartet is he starts out with an incredibly startling chord.
So these 5 really dramatic moments at the start. None of them are in the home key of C major, which you're expecting.
We have no idea what key he's in. And he continues in this vein. It's a slow introduction that is full of mystery and exploration. And kind of puts the listener into a bit of a fog. You're not sure where things are going. Much in the same vein that Mozart began his dissonance quartet. It's a very similar connection, and you can hear the influence of Mozart throughout this first movement particularly.
Here's the opening few bars of Mozart's Dissonance Quartet. The whole thing is really worth a listen, but for now, we'll get back to Beethoven.
I was confused. It says, quartet in C major, a very kind of accessible key. And we start so far away from C major and then get further and further, seemingly further away.
For me, I kind of feel like it's the point where he's sort of deciding, where am I going to be going from this revelation that I'm completely deaf? And he chooses light.
All of a sudden, the air clears and the quartet comes together on 2 chords that suggest the key of C major. But yet we're still not there. And then the first violinist goes off into a rambling cadenza and we think, where's this going?
So a cadenza is like a little flourishing of notes played by a lead instrument. It's often improvised and can be pretty flashy.
And then finally, he brings us back to a sort of triumphant cadence in C major. And then off we go in a very light-hearted, Mozartian almost C major first movement.
We break into this joyful celebration of a theme.
Full of fun turns and cheeky devices. It's an incredible way to begin the quartet. Then he takes us into a very contemplative, brooding second movement, and I don't think he's ever written a slow movement that's quite like this one. In fact, it's not really slow. It's marked andante con moto quasi allegretto. Quite a vague description, really, when you think about it. At an easy walking pace, but with some motion, but a little bit lively. Just a little bit. It evokes a sort of very melancholic Russian folk song, kind of pizzicato in the cello that provides a walking bass, like a heartbeat.
It's almost meditative, this cello pizzicato that is almost the whole way through.
That has this sort of beautifully bleak, slow-moving, chillingly poetic footsteps about it all the way through, which I don't think he necessarily intended for it to feel like you were walking through some sort of Russian beautiful winter, but it certainly, in my mind, conjures these images.
It is extremely evocative. And I think despite what comes next, this second movement perhaps is the movement that stands out in this quartet as being the most unique and the most original of his entire quartet output.
It's my favourite movement, I think.
And then we go into a minuet that is almost overly simple in its design and its effect.
In case you are wondering, the word minuet, or sometimes minuet and trio, is a musical style that is defined as a slow, elegant dance, although it's often a bit quicker than slow, and it's usually in 3/4 timing. Traditionally, the minuet takes place as the third movement of a piece, although it can sometimes be the second movement.
Again, coming back to this light.
It's very pure. There's not a whole lot going on. It is almost like he is making a point of taking us back in time. I think its innocence and its purity is what gives it this sort of sense of beauty. And then, without pause, he takes us into the final fugue, the last movement. Starts out in the viola.
Got through the beautiful searching second movement and stopped, looked at my colleagues and said, "Is this me?"
And then the second violin. And then the cello. And then finally the first violin bursts in forte. It's one of my favourite moments.
Fugues are this sort of sense of chasing and complexity that actually Haydn and Mozart had done less of because it wasn't really fashionable. But Beethoven loved a good fugue. And he thought, well, I know this is not what everybody wants, but this is what you're going to get.
It's absolutely thrilling to play, to listen to.
Such a thrilling ride. It is one of the most gripping finales of all of his quartets.
I think Beethoven is always challenging. There's always a lot of consideration from the four of us. In fact, in and outside the rehearsal room, we talk about it constantly. What we've read, what we listened to, and things we've discovered. We're really fascinated in trying to learn more about him and about the music and about where it's come from and where we want to take it.
Oh, look, I love playing this piece. There's always more to discover. This finale, this grand fugue, is his message to humanity that, you know what, I'm okay with where I'm at and there's a lot more to come from me. And when I'm performing this piece, I feel that same sense of optimism.
It's terrifying. As we're getting into the 19th century, the nature of string quartet writing is changing. The nature of viola role in the string quartet is changing, I think for the better. Certainly have more to sink my teeth into, but that does mean that, you know, the spotlight does shine on those inner voices more often than they have in the past.
Beethoven for a string quartet player is sort of the pinnacle of what we do. It's just some of the most incredible music.
Can you imagine being in the audience when this quartet was first performed? Listening to that startling opening chord and then the ensuing chromatic fog that unfolds, they must have been really perplexed. They must have thought he'd lost his mind. And then suddenly the sun comes out and everything is okay for a while. But already there are elements that Beethoven is trying something completely new. And the audiences then must have just been quite dumbfounded. And I'd like to think that we can still convey that sense of discovery and exploration to our audiences today.
You know, a lot of people come to us afterwards to talk about specific movements. The second movement, I think, is very touching for a lot of people. And the last movement is really where you sometimes can actually hear the audience. It's really fun, and it's that sort of thing that, you know, I love about chamber music, that it really brings people together like that in this sort of intimate way. It never gets old. It's wonderful.
My journey of this quartet was one of searching and celebration, and I guess it's kind of stayed the same. As with most of the music that I love more and more as time goes by. Listening, playing once, over and over and over again, is the greatness of Beethoven. The more I play and listen to it, the more I fall in love with it. I would encourage anyone who's not heard this before to hear it.
It is this joyous celebration of brilliance and all those skills that he had before he was deaf. It suddenly finds this new urgency and grandness. And it's an amazing piece.
So after all this, how can I answer my question? What is it about Beethoven that makes him regarded as one of the greatest of all time? I'm thinking about how Michael points us to the artist who paints what they've already perceived. Maybe this is the place to start. And as a storyteller through sound, in losing his ability to hear, Beethoven lost the one tool that he absolutely needed. One would consider it impossible for him to go on, but instead, as Francesca notes, it seems he made a conscious decision to choose light. And so through the greatest conceivable adversity, Beethoven pushes through to create not only incredible music, but music that expresses joy. The very opposite of what one could only assume he was feeling himself. Chris's experience of discovering Beethoven's music, I think, can reflect our own. A journey of searching and celebration. Beethoven makes our interpretation of his complex, nuanced music so very accessible. And finally, as Dale suggests at the start of this episode, Beethoven's music speaks to human emotions, struggles, and triumph. It is, at its core, an expression of humanity. My pondering brings me to this proposition. What are we, if not on a constant quest through adversity to find beauty? From the moment we are born, in spite of aging bodies, harsh environments, existential conflict, and limited resources, I kind of feel like we're tuned not just to survive, but to flourish, to seek actualization. beauty, joy. I feel like we know Beethoven because he shows us how to be ourselves in the most stunning way. In his vivid depictions, we can interpret what it is to be human. We are exceptional. He is exceptional. I only wish he could have heard it for himself. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet. You can listen to recordings of Beethoven's String Quartet No.9 in C major Opus 59 No.3 via asq.com.au or your streaming platform of choice. The music you heard in this episode is Beethoven's Symphony No. 9 in D minor, second movement molto vivace, recorded by the London Symphony Orchestra. Mozart's String Quartet in D major K465 Dissonance, performed by the Australian String Quartet, recorded live in 2020 by Jakub Gardosinski, and Beethoven's String Quartet No. 9, Opus 59 No.3 Razumovsky, performed by the Australian String Quartet in 2022, recorded live by David Spring and O'Rourke and mastered by Jakub Gardosinski. For every episode of Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet, we commission and feature an original piece of music by a contemporary artist, using samples from that episode's subject. This episode's sampler was created by composer and violinist Belinda Gerlert. Learn more and listen to the whole track via asq.com.au/podcast. The theme music for this podcast was created by Ghana-based composer, producer and multi-instrumentalist Adam Page. This episode was recorded on Ngunnawal country, Canberra, and produced and edited on Kaurna country, South Australia at the University of Adelaide. Feel free to listen to more episodes of our Inner Voices podcast. Think of them as a one-stop convenience shop for picking up morsels of inspiration about living life more musically. Catch you next time.